I want to welcome those who will be joining us via YouTube for the Moorhead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We are studying through the Revelation of John. And tonight we're going to be in Revelation 21, but just recall that the chapter before, John was talking about seeing an angel coming down from heaven and putting a chain on the dragon and throwing him in the abyss for 1,000 years. And so the idea that he is going to be contained. He talks about later that he's going to be released for a short time. And if we look at the context of the book, the idea is he was the mastermind behind the beast and the false prophet in terms of making people worship the emperor and punishing really Christians who didn't do that. Well, now he's not going to be able to influence the world anymore because he's been contained. We know that he's going to be there for a complete period of time. That's what the 1,000 years represents. Then, chapter 20, he's going to be released, and that he's essentially going to deceive again, and he is going to essentially cause those who he deceived again to persecute Christians. And again, sort of seems to go back the idea that persecution against the Christians would be began again. And so probably from what we're looking at, the idea from later Roman emperors. And then at the close of chapter 20, there is the great judgment scene. And so we see in verse 10 of Revelation 20 that the devil was thrown into the lake of fire. What we're seeing is a finality of things. The beast and the false prophet were thrown in the lake of fire in chapter 19. Here in chapter 20, the devil is thrown in the lake of fire. Then we have a great judgment. This is really would include all of those who had the mark of the beast, that worship the emperor and all that. The idea that the great judgment of really all souls, and essentially those who were worshiping the emperor and those who were sinful people would also be cast in the lake of fire. And so the idea, the finality of all of this that we've gone through, those great persecutors are all dealt with. And essentially we get to chapter 21, we're leaving all of that behind. So John is now going to be given a different vision, and it's with something, the idea of what is going to, sort of this new direction. Now that essentially everything's been taken care of in terms of the persecution, all that, now we're seeing this whole new scene. And so John directs our attention to a new heaven and a new earth and the blessings and the glory of that. And so that's where we're going to be tonight. And so if I can get a volunteer to read verses 1 through 4.
You can do it.
Jenna, did you want to do 5 through 8?
Ron said he could.
Yeah.
Ron.
Yeah, Brian will do 5 through 8, and Jenna's volunteered to do 1 through 4. So whenever you're ready. We're in chapter 21 of Revelation.
And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he shall dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be among them. And he shall wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there shall no longer be any death. There shall no longer be any mourning, or crying, or pain. The first things have passed away.
And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Also he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowardly and faithless, and detestable as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars. Their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death.
All right. So let's as we're looking at this, obviously what comes into focus is trying to understand what the new heaven and the new earth is. And so I want to start out by telling you what the premillennialists believe. Now, they're not exact on all of their details, but I just want to give you an idea. And I'm going to give you two different explanations of the new heaven and earth from these premillennialists. First one is Tim LaHaye in his book Revelation Illustrated Made Plain. And here's what he had to say. Because it is God's plan for man to inhabit the earth forever in fulfillment of his promises, after he does away with this planet as we know it, he will create a new heaven and a new better than anything this world has ever known. Nothing in the text indicates a new earth limited to the 25,000 miles in circumference and 8,000 miles in diameter of the present earth. It may be much larger, but one thing is certain, the new earth will be the Christian's heaven. When the Christian talks about going to heaven, he means in the soul state, provided he dies before the rapture. After the resurrection of the body, believers will come to earth to reign with Christ during the millennium. After that 1,000 years, we will live forever on the new earth described in our text, unquote. David Jeremiah in his book, After the Rapture, an End Times Guide to Survival says, quote, out of this purged mass of God's creative work, he's talking about the present heavens and earth, he will reshape, he will remake, he will recreate all of the heavens and this earth. There will be no destruction of what God has made. It is a renewal. It is a renaissance. It is a regeneration. It is a recreation. God will draw the curtains on human history, and the entire universe will undergo a purifying conflagration. He's talking about a fire, destructive fire. All evidence of disease will be burned up. All evidence of disobedience will melt away. All the remnants and results of sin, sorrow, and suffering will be destroyed. Out of the smoldering ruins, God will recreate all physical reality, and he will bring forth a fresh universe, a new heaven, and a new earth. When you look at what they have to say, David Jeremiah almost makes sound the idea says we're still going to have, sort of a material heavens and earth. And one thing that you'll learn as you look at what the premillennialists say is they believe in the actuality of all the details in terms of what John describes in Revelation 21. And it's almost, like I said, they almost sort of believe the idea is there's going to be a reconfigure. So they believe, in essence, that the present earth and the present heavens are going to be removed, and then in their place there's going to be another earth and another heavens, and we'll live on this other earth. Okay, and so that's essentially what they believe. However, when we look at what's being talked about here, it's really not the intention of the author to essentially say that God is going to get rid of the material earth and the universe and essentially create another heaven, another earth. What we're really talking about is an abode for the redeemed, an abode for those souls that are saved, and we're really just talking about heaven. Again, John is just seeing visions. Remember, this is the problem that the premillennialists has, is they try to take what John sees almost in everything, and they always try to make it a literal application, and that's where you get in trouble, because these are just visions. And essentially, when you think about it from the perspective of humankind, I've used the word accommodative. all we've ever understood is what we see now. So we have an earth and we have heavens. When you describe this to those who are looking ahead in the future, who are undergoing this persecution, and you're describing the future, you're giving them a sense of comfort in giving them understanding, well, God is going to get rid of these things. He is going to essentially have this new place in store. But it creates problems. In other words, when we read the other passages of scriptures, we don't really see that there's going to be an actual another earth and an actual another heaven, but heaven itself. And many passages talk about we have our citizenship in heaven. If we have our citizenship in heaven, and there are various verses where it talks about that we're going to have eternal life with him in heaven, then what would be the purpose of having another earth? What we're supposed to understand from this is we're talking about a whole new realm. So the idea of this realm is being disposed of, the material universe, and the idea that we're going to go as Christians to this new realm. And so John is seeing this. He is he is describing it to us. And what it means here by new is according to Art Gingrich's Greek lexicon, is the fact that the old one has become obsolete and is being replaced with something different, something new, and something superior in kind to the old. Okay? So John will say, as he's talking here, the first heaven and the first earth passed away. And John had said back in Revelation 20, verse 11, the earth and heaven fled away, and there was no place for them. And so when we're talking about sort of at the end of all things, so we've had the great judgment. Obviously, those who are not making it to heaven have already been dealt with. The idea they're going into the lake of fire and brimstone. Now we're talking about really the abode of the righteous, okay? And so there's no need for the former present, the material universe that we have now. And so now we have something else is going to be here. And so the new heaven and new earth is a description of the final dwelling place of faithful Christians. It is a spiritual replacement for what we've always known this realm to be. And contrary to the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's not going to be a renovated earth that will be the eternal home of the saved. And so if you understand sort of Jehovah's Witness theology, only 144,000 people go to heaven. Everybody else, there's no more room. 144,000 go there, and everybody else, essentially, who are faithful, righteous people, are going to live on a kind of a refurbished earth. Kind of after the flood with water, God's going to do something with fire. Then we're going to have really a perfect earth. There won't be disease. People will be petting lions and zebras and all kinds of stuff like that. So when you talk to them about, hey, I want to go to heaven, they'll say, well, why do you want to go to heaven so much? And it seems odd because we understand that, because the only choice is hell. But for them, the idea is heaven's full already. So the rest of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the present ones living now, they are all going to live on a refurbished earth, if you will.
And then you said that heaven is full for them, and wasn't it full from like 1912 or something like that?
Yeah, like they were promised from the founder of Jehovah's Witnesses, the generation of 1918 or something like that, was going to be the entirety of those who are going to go to heaven. And really, the idea, think about 144,000, where did you get that idea from? From the book of Revelation. And the problem is that numbers are symbolic, they're not actual. And as we've studied the passage already back there where it talked about that, they said that they were all virgins, and they were males and all that. So are you willing to accept the fact that when it's talked about there, that it's, there's going to be no women in heaven? Obviously they're not going to have the genders, but the idea is it makes it very much sound that way from what they're saying. So, but they're misunderstanding, just like the premillennialists, and trying to take so much of what Revelation is saying is literally. And so we're talking about a complete new environment, an immaterial place, a place that's designed for our transformed, resurrected bodies. It's going to be set up for that. So Wayne Jackson, in his book, he's a brother in Christ, Wayne Jackson, Revelation, Jesus Christ's Final Message of Hope, Select Studies from Apocalypse, says, quote, "We now live in the flesh in the material world. Our only perceptions as gained from personal experience are material in nature. Thus, we simply are not, at this present stage of our existence, prepared to clearly understand what heaven will actually be like. In this regard, it is a challenge to walk by faith, for we cannot walk by sight. Consequently, the Spirit has employed many figures of speech consisting of precious material things to convey to us the value of heaven." In other words, how do you explain heaven if you've never seen it? And the only way that you have it essentially is to take the things that are known of this age and essentially say, it's going to be like this and look like this and be like this, because then you can identify with something. But if you have nothing to identify, then you're sort of lost, because you have no understanding. Your whole experience is this realm. So you won't have no idea exactly of sort of the glory and the beauty of heaven. Any questions about anything so far? Okay. So I want to draw your attention to the end of verse 21. It says, "And there is no longer any sea." And I think that's a curious comment there. Some commentators see that the sea being done away with because of how it came out in John's visions. Remember, who came out of the sea? It was the beast, right? And so we have that happening in chapter 13, and then we see that in chapter 12, that the dragon tried to drown the woman with waters. And some people sort of believe that the idea is that this would be something to give encouragement, since water seems to be something that the forces of evil essentially use to their benefit. And so the idea that there's not going to be any long sea. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the position that I'm with, but it gives some explanation as to why all of a sudden there's no sea. Again, we're talking about an immaterial place. And so verse 2, it says, John says, "And I saw," so he sees in this vision, "the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband." And so now we're getting something else taking place. So we've got this new heaven, new earth, and now all of a sudden there's a city coming out of heaven, and it is essentially coming down on earth. The premillennialist David Jeremiah, in his book After the Rapture, an End Time Guide to Survival, says, quote, "The final 2 chapters of the Bible use the word city 11 times to describe our eternal home. And I don't believe it's a figure of speech. It is an actual physical place, a real city. The New Jerusalem is an actual physical city presently located within the third heaven." Well, then we're talking about a material place again. This is where we're going to run into trouble, is that where God's at is an immaterial place. So it's hard to believe that the premillennialists want to put so much credibility and weight on that and say, okay, so in God's realm, God is spirit, and he's in a spirit realm, that you're going to have a physical, a material place where he's at. It just doesn't fit with what we know in Scripture, even before we get to the book of Revelation. It talks about the city being holy. What does that mean? About being a holy city.
Only the righteous would dwell.
Okay, so the idea is not everybody's going to be there. We're talking about holy. We're talking about those who are dedicated to God. You know, they're set apart for the service of God. It's a holy city. What kind of city was Babylon when we talked about it earlier?
Wicked.
It was a wicked city. And the idea is there's all kinds of terrible things were going on there. And so we sort of have a contrast between a holy city, the New Jerusalem, and this wicked city. And the idea is the wicked city, you know, everybody who essentially involves themselves with that are going to be in that, involved with that city, but only the righteous are going to be tied to the holy city. And so the new spiritual Jerusalem, in contrast with the physical Jerusalem of the Old Covenant. The one in the Old Covenant, of course, was literally in Israel, and the New Jerusalem will be in heaven. I want us to look at what Peter said here in 2 Peter 3 in verse 13, because that goes back to what we're talking about here, about this holy city and the new heavens and the new earth. So I want to look at 2 Peter 3 and verse 13. So we read about the new heavens and new earth before we get to the book of Revelation. And here in 2 Peter 3:13 it says, "But according to his promise, we are looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells." And so the idea that this city is a blessed city. This city is a place that is going to be separated from all of the wicked of the world. Only the righteous are going to be there. And that is who this city is for. And it says that it's coming down from heaven. And again, so we're seeing this vision. We shouldn't see the idea that when God gets rid of the present heaven and earth, the idea that now all of a sudden there's going to be another earth, another heaven, God's going to be in heaven, people are going to be on the earth. But the idea is giving us figures that we can identify. In other words, it is a realm that we're going to live, okay? And so it talks about this city, the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And I liked what Jim McGuigan, a brother in Christ, wrote in a book called The Book of Revelation that he wrote. He says, quote, "The arrival of the New Jerusalem is seen from an earthly viewpoint. The city obviously comes down to earth. Why is that? What's being stressed? Its divine nature and origin. The two beasts came up out of the sea and earth. While the beasts are said to rise out of the sea and earth, the Messianic kingdom, embodied in the Son of Man, rides in the heavens. Here we have divine nature and origin contrasted to human and evil origin." And so the idea is these beasts come up from the earth. The idea in this heavenly vision, the idea is this city comes from God. It says that the city is made ready as a bride adorned for a husband. And as we look at the idea of the bride adorned for a husband, what we see, even going back to Ephesians chapter 5, and we're really talking about the Lord's church, okay? We're really talking about, the bride of Christ. We're talking about that entity that belongs to Christ. And in chapter 19, I believe that's where we saw the marriage of the Lamb, and the bride readied herself. And it talked about in verse 8 about that she was clothed with fine linen, bright and clean, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Obviously, it's talking about God's people. And so this is a symbolic reference about a woman who is a bride to be preparing herself for her wedding day. Let me turn the page here. Verse 3, unless there's any questions about the holy city or anything we want to touch there. Okay, verse 3, John says, "And I heard a loud voice from the heavens saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he shall dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be among them." So the loud voice from heaven, as recorded by John, will speak words of great comfort to John and the readers of this book who were suffering. They needed to sort of see the light at the end of the tunnel. I think that's not only something beneficial that they need to see, but as Christians, we need to see the light of the tunnel. Too many times we're stuck right here, and we're thinking about how hard the Christian life is, and living the Christian life, and turning away from evil, and trying to do things God wants, and we forget about the big picture is that God has something in store for us. This would certainly be something that would be encouraging for them to read about from John. And so they were suffering mightily for their faithfulness to God, and so the message conveys a bright, blessed future for the faithful, and that is the abode of heaven that is waiting as a reward. The tabernacle, of course, goes back to that first structure that the Israelites had, in which the priest went in there and ministered before God. It was a tent-like structure. Eventually, David replaced it, or actually had Solomon build it, a hardened structure. But we're really talking about that. And so, looking at this, the idea of is God's dwelling place, and it really, if we think about what a tabernacle is about in terms of in relation to God or a temple, it is a place of God's abiding presence. So here, looking at verse 3, the idea is that, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men. The idea of God's abiding presence. The saying of verse 3 is found in Ezekiel 37:27 and in Zechariah 8 and verse 8. And just as the tabernacle or the pre-temple, which represented God's presence, was with his Old Testament saints, the idea here is that the tabernacle of God, which is in heaven, which John saw, would be with the New Testament saints who were in heaven, and God would be present with his people who are the holy ones of Christ. And the idea is that's hard to believe. I mean, not that we can't believe it, but the idea is hard to imagine, I guess the words I want. The idea that God himself will actually be there. Our whole experience is that in this realm, God is someone we don't see. God is with us in a sense that he helps us to live the Christian life, but the idea of actuality, that he will actually be present with his people. And John continues as he writes things down. Verse 4, he says, and he shall wipe away every tear from their eyes. It's going back to God. There shall no longer be any death. There shall no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. I want you to think about what those Christians that were persecuted were going through. Do you think they shed some tears? Do you think that they've got to experience a lot of death and suffering around them? Do you think they experienced a lot of mourning and pain? And the idea is, guys, cheer up. The idea is God is going to take all of that away. And so you think about in the time in which they lived, where you have this superpower. It's like being like in a communist country, and essentially you can't ever escape, and the regime is very oppressive, and you can't imagine what it would be like to ever be free from sort of the tyranny and all of the things that are going on. And here's sort of the glimpse of hope, and the idea is it's just not always going to be that way. All of the pain and the sorrow that you're experiencing in trying to be faithful to the Lord, the idea is God is going to take it all away. And it is a blessed promise to those brethren as well as to us today. There are many living today that find comfort in the words from the throne of God in verse 4. However, these words here are not to the unsaved and the spiritually lost. How many people essentially live the way they want to live? They take the Bible and they read certain things, they think, one day I'm going to go to a better place. And so the idea that the world sort of becomes a hellish place, and one day I'm going to be free from that, I'm going to be with God. Well, this is not promised to everybody who's especially sheds tears or is mourning or experiencing pain. This is talking about Christians. This is something that's promised to Christians, and only they're going to have the promise of this. And the idea is everything is going to be removed from them that cause the pain, the suffering, the crying, all those things. And the idea is once all of those things are removed, then truly you're going to be able to enjoy what God has in store in the heavenly realm. And any questions about that so far? Okay. John also writes, and there shall no longer be death. And so when we think about when death occurs in this realm, it is a separation of the eternal spirit from the bodily container. At death, one spirit returns to God. God assigns it a temporary holding place in Hades, either in paradise or the place of suffering, Luke 16. The lifeless body is buried and decays. But death also separates the living from those who die. And the result is the sadness of loss of fellowship. In the death and resurrection of Christ, we see that he accomplished salvation as well as immortality. Romans 6 and verse 5, 2 Timothy 1 and verse 10, Christ becomes the first fruits of those who have died, never to die again. 1 Corinthians 15, 20 and following. John wrote in Revelation 20 verse 14 that death and Hades were being destroyed by the lake of fire. In other words, that's not going to happen anymore. When we go to the next realm, the idea of the concept of death is going to be gone. It's not going to happen. And if there's no more persecution, suffering, the idea is there's not going to be any more death. And so we won't have the despair that comes with death. And we will receive the comfort of God, not only in this life, but forever in the life to come. Because in this life, we receive the comfort from God, we still are going to experience suffering and struggling in this life. The beautiful thing is that God makes this promise. So if we don't like this realm and we're struggling living the Christian life and we don't like this realm, the idea is if we continue to be faithful to God, one day all of the pain, the sorrow, the sickness, all of those things are going to be taken away. And that seems like a great incentive to focus on the blessings, the future blessings to come, versus focusing so much now on how hard it is to live the Christian life. Obviously, it's hard to live the Christian life. But the idea is for those who do, that are faithful, God has made great promises that he's obligated to fulfill. It says here, the first things have passed away. And the idea is, according to Thayer's Greek English Lexicon, it's talking about the first order of things. In other words, we're talking about the material heavens and the idea of that whole realm, everything with that. So the idea of the pain, the sorrow, the suffering, all of that stuff essentially is going to be removed when the first things are passed away. Any questions about verse 4? Verse 5, John says, and he who sits on the throne said, behold, I am making all things new. And he said, right, for these things are faithful and true. The word new here, kainos, the Greek word here, is new in contrast to something old, in the sense that what is old has become obsolete. It's been replaced. And what is new, as a rule, is superior to the old kind. In other words, even though everything that we've ever known in terms of the material universe is going to be taken away, what essentially comes for us is going to be better than ever. It's going to be something that is going to be far greater than what we have now. The voice of verse 3 must have been from an angelic being, because here in verse 5, God himself speaks in the vision John saw, and the fact that God is speaking the words uttered from the throne here in verse 5 is for the purpose of doubling down on what was spoken by an angel in verse 3. There will be a new heaven and a new earth, the spiritual realm of heaven, and God will be there with his people to comfort them forevermore in this new realm. And the idea is you can count on. And so God says to John, write, for these things are faithful. And the Greek word here means inspiring trust, dependable. These things are faithful and true. And the idea here, the Greek word is in accordance with truth. You can be sure about these things, because I'm saying that to you now. It's been said, I'm essentially saying that. And then he says in verse 6, and he said to me, it is done. We're talking about what's going on here, what God has promised. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of water of life without cost. We've seen this phrase, the Alpha and the Omega, before in Revelation 1 and verse 8. And we're going to see it again in Revelation 22 and verse 13. The words Alpha and Omega are from the Greek alphabet. Alpha is the first letter in the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last. And so when he says, I am the beginning and the end, the idea is these represent sort of God, that he is the beginning and end. He is the first and the last. And I liked what J.W. Roberts in his book, The Revelation of John, the Living Word Commentary says, quote, "These words of his eternal nature do not merely mean that God is at the beginning and end of history. Rather, God is the ground and the goal of all existence, because he is its author and sustainer. At the beginning of Revelation, this was evidently intended to assure the suffering church that God had not absconded, departed secretly or hid himself from this world, but knew and had a purpose in their suffering. He was ever in control. So the God who will dwell in the midst of his people in the holy city is the same God who has met in the processes of history and who has ever revealed himself as the beginning and end, the first and last, the A to Z. And God says, I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of the water of life without cost. In other words, the Greek word means without payment, the idea of a gift. And these words kind of come out in Revelation 7:16 and 17, where in verse 17 it talks about the Lamb being the shepherd and will guide them to springs of the water of life. And I like a quote here I wrote in my Bible years ago. It says, around this passage here, it said, one will never be motivated to come to Christ until he becomes spiritually thirsty. Makes sense. Maybe that's why, the idea is when you tell people about Christ and they're like, yeah, I don't think that's for me. Why? Because they're not spiritually thirsty. They don't recognize sort of that deep need that really all of us have for Christ. Homer Haley, in his book, The Book of Revelation, and introduction commentary, says, quote, nothing will be lacking in the complete fullness and realization of all spiritual desires of the glorified soul in heaven, unquote. Any comments or questions about verse 6?
Nobody can expect to keep growing if they're not, thirsty and hungry for the word. Yeah. You have to, it's a daily thing. You have to wake up daily and study.
Right.
There's the big talkers.
Yeah.
There's big leaders that talk in the church and go and do things that they're not supposed to do.
Right.
I'm not, I'm just talking about the world in general and stuff. So God knows that secret sin, so we have to lead, because a leader is more responsible than your average Christian and stuff. So we have to lead and make sure we're doing it right, to be productive in that and stuff. So we have to be hungry and thirsty for the word and strive to do that, because it has to be a process daily. It has to be, you need to make that your addiction. You can't expect to grow. He that comes to God must believe he is a rewarder of those that seek him diligently. Hope is the things, we hope, and that creates faith when we have hope, and I'm working with Brian on that, faith and stuff, and teaching about that and renewing in the mind. But we have to, pray and develop a deeper relationship daily to keep growing and understanding what you're talking about, hungry and thirsty for the word.
Sure. So I think about sort of as the idea that the words are put in that the word speaks to give to the one who thirsts from the springs of the water of life. And so the idea is, as I think about how satisfied we are with water that we have, and you can go to a grocery store and buy a whole thing of water from somewhere between $2 and $5, and that's pretty cheap. But imagine if you had no clean water and all the water was left at that same grocery store. You think they'd still sell it for between $2 something and $5? The idea is the water supply gets less and less for clean water. The idea is that the prices, in other words, this water that seems so cheap and we take it for granted would essentially become worth incredible amount of money. People would recognize, I want to get that water, I'm willing to pay $10 for it, and after a while I'm willing, if I can't find water, I'm willing to pay $20 or whatever it is, because it's really the water of life. And so the idea that Jesus offers a spring of the water of life, because just as our physical body needs water, we're 90-something% water, that we need water. The idea is we're talking about a spiritual water. The idea of a spiritual water that Christ is going to offer without cost. In other words, he's going to give. It's going to be a gift. Obviously, there's going to be requirements on our end if we receive really the salvation of God. But the idea is he's going to give it to us. It's just like having salvation. How much does God charge us? He's willing to give it to us, really on the condition that we give our lives to him. But
Sometimes when you study, though, I get this way. It feels like, you want to learn more or understand more, but that gives you the determination to go back to, and study more.
Right.
You got to have that kind of
Well,
attitude.
and the word adds really just that spiritual nutrition that we need. The idea is those words help the spirit
some of the
within us.
back Proverbs are not all Proverbs,
Yeah.
and it tells you a lot about understanding, wisdom,
Sure.
and stuff. And I
Yeah.
recommend a lot of people to read that book because it does teach
A lot of
about
good stuff.
being
there.
a Christian, to not open mouth and insert foot. So, yeah.
Okay, let's take on verse 7 here. Now, so John is still recording the words of God here. Verse 7, who's speaking, he says, he who overcomes shall inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. So this word overcomes has been one of the key words that have come up over and over in the book of Revelation. And obviously it has a meaning for us today, but there was a meaning for this initial audience that John is writing to. What are they supposed to overcome?
The sins of the world of temptation.
What are they supposed to overcome?
The trial they're going through.
The what?
The trials and temptation they're going through.
Okay, so yeah, obviously, remember, they're being persecuted. And this really goes back to Revelation 2 and verse 10, where, he says, be faithful until death, and I will give you a crown of life. You've got to overcome. So the idea of conquering, the Greek word, where we get the word Nike, the idea of conquering, overcoming, vanquish. And so early Christians were encountering severe persecution. And essentially, think about this. The idea is that at some point, that persecution comes on you, and it comes to you at a point where all of a sudden you may be incarcerated because you won't worship the emperor, or you're going to be threatened with the loss of your life, and you have to make a decision. If you're a smart Christian, you've already made that decision before you got there, because then you know what you're going to do. If you're a Christian that's not strong in your faith, you might think, all I have to do is put a little incense there and say, Caesar is Lord God, and I can go home. And of course, that was idolatry. The idea is if you've got to overcome, you have to essentially, as Christians, have to be faithful to God, even if it requires losing everything, losing your life. Because if you overcome, you're going to inherit what things? These things that he's promised about, this heavenly land, the idea of the new heaven, the new earth, and the idea of this holy city. You're going to inherit that. If you essentially sacrifice to the emperor and you capitulate to that, you're not going to get any of that. It might seem like a sensible thing in the moment, but essentially you're forfeiting your eternity. So you essentially have to overcome these things, and then you're going to inherit them. And then he says, I will be his God, and he will be my son. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 1, John says, see how great a love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called children of God. This is really about the idea of having the right of being his children, or the privilege. And so here, the idea that you're accepted as God's children. If you're not accepted as God's children, you're not going to receive that heavenly land. You're not going to enjoy the Father and Son relationship in heaven. Any questions about verse 7? Okay, maybe we can get in verse 8, because that's really the first section there. John says, John's recording what the word says here, but for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars, their part will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Brimstone is something that we've seen before in other situations, the idea that it's something that God used in relation to judgment. And he's talking about the lake that burns with fire and brimstone. That's hell. Okay, so as he's talking about this, laying out all of these things, the idea, here's this new heaven, new earth, here's this holy city. God's going to take away all your crying, your mourning, your sorrow, and the idea that you're going to be a son. If you're essentially a faithful Christian, this is all for you. But if you're here in verse 8, bad things. And so there's assurance and comfort and reward for faithful Christians. The same is not true for Christians who capitulate to the demands of the beast and the false prophet to engage in idolatrous worship in order to preserve their lives. Some of these sins also apply, obviously, to the non-Christians who participated in that evil, adulterous, immoral behavior perpetrated by the beast and the false prophet. And so when we think about the words cowardly here, Thayer's Greek English Lexicon defines as timid or fearful of Christians who through cowardice give way under persecution and apostatize. In other words, I'm not going to die today. I want to go home. Caesar is Lord God. You see, and so the idea is if you're a Christian that essentially gives in, you give way in order to escape whatever consequences may come across you for being a faithful Christian, you'd be included among the cowardly. The unbelieving here would probably go back to the same thing. The idea is if you capitulate, you essentially become faithless. That's what the word means. The idea that unbelieving, you're in worshiping the emperor, obviously you don't have faith in God as you should. And it also could be used of non-Christians, obviously, because they're faithless and unbelieving. The abominable, of course, are those who are detestable. They do detestable things. So we're just talking about evil works that people do, immoral. I liked what Brian's translation said. It really talks about a fornicator, one who practices sexual immorality. And so obviously if you're worshiping the emperor, that's spiritual fornication. If you're practicing
Sexual morality is anything outside of marriage.
Right. And so we're talking about those who practice sexual immorality, and we're talking about sorcerers, the idea of somebody involved with the occult and things like that. And so that was some of the things that were practiced back in the time as well today. Idolaters, so the idea of somebody who worships an idol. Well, if you're worshiping Caesar, that's an idolater. And liars. And so we could again apply the idea is if you put incense on an altar to Caesar and say Caesar is Lord God, you're a liar. You do that, you're a liar. If you tell lies, you're a liar too. So the idea is that it has a specific application as well as a general application. And he says the lake that burns with fire and brimstone is the second death. So think about the idea of death, physical death being the first death, and the idea is if you don't have a relationship with God, if you're not a child of God, you haven't obeyed the gospel, then you'll experience the second death, which is eternal destruction, hell. Any questions about verse 8? Okay, this is a good place to draw the line because 9 through 27 is really the next big section. So we've already kind of tried to figure out what book we're going to move into after that we get done with this. A little bit left that we have a Revelation. It's going to be the book of Joshua. What?
Judges.
Okay. All right, that was close. Judges. Why did I say Joshua? I don't know. But I want to thank those who are joined us via YouTube. Hopefully the video will be a blessing to you, and Lord willing, we'll have another video next week. God bless you.